All right, Read 516, welcome back for part 2 of week 5. So we're starting to talk about phonics, and we're talking about regular words here. So this is the first part of what we're going to be looking at for session 3. So what is phonics, right? So phonics is that relationship between the grapheme and the phoneme. So it's the relationship between letters, which are the grapheme, in written language, and the individual sounds, the phonemes, in spoken language. So why is it important? Well, phonics teaches students how to use these relationships to read and spell words, right? I'd say that's pretty important in the context of learning anything. Decoding, right? So the process of converting the written word to the spoken word is what we call decoding. And we believe that phonics instruction should be systematic and explicit, right? So we are actually talking about teaching students phonics in a explicit and systematic way. Systematic meaning that you use a particular structured progression, as we talk about here, and explicit in the fact that we are pointing out the phonics pieces that we are working on, and having students practice those explicitly, both in isolation and within context, right? So the contrast to systematic and explicit would be teaching phonics in an embedded fashion, much the way they would in whole language. So, phonics assessments. How can we assess phonics abilities? So, the core phonics survey is one of those, and that's actually going to be a required assessment for this week. There is the test you may be familiar with, the BPST, right? The basic phonics skills test. That's a popular one. The Tower assessment, which you can find on page 418 in your text, which is the test of word reading efficiency. There are lots of different word lists, and we'll talk about some of those later on. Informal tests, name tests, so they give examples of those in your book. The phonics assessments by Schenker and Cockrum, observation of graphophonic skills in context, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the running records, or those records of oral reading, which can be very helpful when you listen to students decode in context. The miscue analysis, word sorts. So all kinds of different ways that you can assess phonics. And so some of those you're going to be required to do. Some of those are just good to know that they exist, right? So let's talk then about that core phonics survey, since that is a required assessment. Some of the things that you need to give that is obviously a copy of the student material pages and the record form. So when you take a look at it, there's teacher pages and there's student pages. The instructions for each part of that assessment, you can find it on the record form. You can help focus students' attention by covering up other parts of the test. So you can give them a book or a colorful piece of paper, or just a plain piece of paper, but have them cover up the sections they're not working on so that they can focus on the one that they are, because it can look a little overwhelming for them to have all of that in front of them. I talked a couple of slides ago about this idea of qualitative data. So, be aware of the student's behavior during the test. If they're tired or they're, making lots of errors, you can go ahead and you can stop, and you can note that, and that is part of your reflection. You may come back to it another time, or you may not, because if you stopped it because of the errors. But if you just feel like there's something else that's interfering and you don't want to get this quantitative data that isn't that meaningful because you had other factors that were influencing their performance, then that is reasonable as well. And then kind of a guideline is that if the students don't know 2 or more of the words in each line, don't give those pseudo words that are listed there, and then just go ahead and move on to the next section. I don't actually love the pseudo words piece anyway. Some people do. They feel like it's a really good test of whether or not they can decode. I kind of say it depends on how old the student is. Young students won't necessarily recognize, or very emergent readers, that those are not real words, and they will try to decode them. Older students who have a bunch of words under their belt already may recognize that those aren't pseudo words, and sometimes those pseudo words aren't real words, and sometimes I feel that's just confusing to tell them to go ahead and decode them. But anyway, that's my soapbox regarding nonsense words and pseudo words. So this is what it looks like, okay? So you're doing that alphabetic knowledge, so you're having them tell you the names of the uppercase and the lowercase, those alphabet skills, letters and sounds. You move on to the consonant sounds, and so on and so forth through the assessment. You'll see that the things that you're assessing here map on nicely to that ERIES phases of word development that we looked at a few slides before. So I'm sure you'll see the parity there and how this assessment was developed. So let's talk a little bit about good phonics instruction, right? So good phonics instruction should help students develop that understanding of the alphabetic principle. It should incorporate phonemic awareness, right? So we do the phonemic awareness kind of first, and then we do it in tandem with the phonics instruction. So they need a little bit of they need a good foundation in phonemic awareness, or else you can't do the phonics instruction, but we do them in tandem as students develop. Good phonics instruction should provide sufficient practice for students in reading actual words. It leads to automatic word recognition, and we'll talk about this automaticity piece in a little bit. And it should be part of any comprehensive reading program. And so that's the part when we're talking about systematic and explicit. So it's my belief, and the belief of many in this program and many who teach reading, that you should have systematic, explicit instruction in phonics as part of that balanced reading program, right? Not in lieu of, or it shouldn't be absent, but it is there and it's one part. So when do we actually start to teach phonics? The research will tell us that we have the greatest impact on beginning readers, so kinder and first grade. So those of you that teach the little ones, you know that you spend lots of time on phonics and phonics related activities. But you can start it with students as soon as they learn the sounds of a few letters, right? That means they're ready. So if they can start to make some of those initial letter sound correspondence and they're demonstrating that, then they're ready for phonics instruction. And then that phonics instruction should continue until they are able to decode multisyllabic words with automaticity and with fluency. So in a typically developing reader, 2 years of phonics is usually about enough. So if you're familiar with how many teachers in the lower grades teach, you see heavy phonics, kinder and first grade, and then it typically starts to peter out in the second grade, right? And then by the time they're in second grade, we want them to have all that under their belt because they start to make that transition, right? So from the learning to read to the reading to learn piece, which starts to really happen in third grade and above. So that K, that 1, that 2 is so important. And that's also why we talk about why preschool is so important, right? Get them started a little bit early, get their brains ready for language. Not that we're teaching them systematic and explicit phonics in pre-K, and we shouldn't be, but getting them ready for that, so that when they do get to kinder and 1, they're just ready to go. And like I said, we know that students who are not proficient in phonics by the end of grade 1 are really going to continue to struggle in the future in all other areas of reading. So we know that in second grade, they really there's not as much phonics support. It's still a great time to intervene, and a lot of students can make up some of that time if they get that good intervention, but it's obviously better to get that intervention as soon as possible, because once they leave grade 1, there's just not as much room in the curriculum for teachers to spend on phonics or developing their phonics skills. And there's other things that they teach them in 2nd grade to get them ready for the big leap in 3rd and 4th grade that then they will miss out on. So really we want those skills solidified by that end of 1st. So when should we intervene? Let's talk about that. That intervention should begin in kinder and 1st grade, but really as soon as an assessment shows that there's a problem. So you see a student struggling, you have a hunch they're struggling, boom, do that diagnostic, get that data, and start that intervention as soon as possible. Those initial assessments should include those sound spelling correspondence, and then they move gradually to decoding the CVC words. So we kind of start at the beginning piece and see how far we can get, because that's the way we would do the intervention. You can use those measures of nonsense words to isolate some of the actual decoding skills that they may be missing, and it can help show what kind of automaticity they have with actual decoding. And so, like I said, some people like the nonsense word piece because it does just isolate their ability to decode and how quickly they can decode, because they can't it's not a sight word, right? They can't read that word based on their memory because it's not an actual word. But then again, like I just explained, if it's an older student and they've got a bunch of sight words in there, or they're students that guess all the time about words, sometimes it can just be confusing to them to ask them to read this word that actually doesn't exist, but it can give you decent information. So the intervention, so you realize recognize the need for intervention, you do the assessment, you get that data. So what do I do now? So some strategies for instruction, and lots of these are in your phonics A to Z text. And of course, the great thing about the internet now is that you can find all kinds of things pre-made for you already, but some standard go-tos are blending exercises, sorting activities that isolate the piece of the phonics component that you want to work on, the Elkanim boxes, making words games, using decodable text, dictation, phonemic awareness activities are all good phonics builders and phonics instruction. So your phonics A to Z text has a lot of stuff. Words Their Way, depending on the age of your student, has some of those. I don't know if you don't necessarily want to give them the assessment, although you will give them assessment in a couple of weeks. But the activities in the back there are really great that come along with that text. But there's lots of things we can do to get students to practice some of those phonics skills. And often, once we isolate which skills they don't have, it's really just a matter of some quick intervention and activities where they get that repetitive practice with that piece in order for them to get it. Of course, I'm making it sound like it's really easy, but once you do the assessment and you work on that phonics piece, many students can kind of shore up some of those holes, particularly when we get them in K and 1. It gets much more complicated as we get into 2nd grade and 3rd grade and 4th grade to go back and do phonics intervention. So the earlier we can catch it, the more likely we are to kind of fill those holes and get them up to speed with where they need to be, because the gap just isn't that wide yet. All right, I'm going to stop us here, and I'm going to go ahead and pick up with the irregular word reading piece, the second piece, on the next screencast.